Hello, my friends. Eric Feltes here, life coach, speaker, actor, and host of The Great Unbecoming. This is a show about stories of unlearning. What did you let go of in order to become the person you are today? And what did you gain and learn as well? This is a show about letting go of stories that no longer serve us and stepping into our own authenticity. It's about unbecoming what society says you should be and remembering who you are and who you are meant to be. So sit back, relax, and welcome to The Great Unbecoming. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of The Great Unbecoming. I am so excited and a little nervous about this guest because I think he's going to make me feel seen. And sometimes feeling seen is scary, isn't it, Chris? This is a great time for Chris's screen to freeze. Oh no! Are you here now?
Okay. I'm here, yes.
We're just going to start that over. There's always something off the bat that happens. All right, my friends, welcome. Hello, welcome to another episode of The Great Unbecoming. It's Eric Feltes here, and I am both so excited and a little nervous to introduce my guest, Chris Rackliffe, because what we're going to talk about is something that makes me feel seen. And sometimes feeling seen is a little scary, isn't it, Chris?
Oh my goodness, of course it is. Being vulnerable?
Yeah. I always tell people that the number one thing human beings want happens to be the number one thing that we're afraid of the most. And I think it's to be seen.
Truer words never spoken, my friend. Yes.
Yeah, and so we're going to get into what you do and how you help others to process being seen and to feel a sense of belonging even deeper. But before I get too ahead of myself, we have a room full of people listening on the podcast or YouTube. So let me introduce my guest, y'all. This is my new friend, Chris Rackliffe, who is a personal development writer and anxious attachment style coach whose ability to paint with words has touched the lives of millions of people around the world. Rackliffe shares stories that cut straight to the heart, detailing his own heartfelt and harrowing experiences to help others lead happier, healthier, more fulfilling lives. In his books and blogs, keynotes, and coaching sessions, Rackliffe blends principles of psychology, philosophy, physics, and spirituality with his signature storytelling aimed to make you feel and heal. I love that. His new book, It's Good to See Me Again, How to Find Your Way When You Feel Lost, a guidebook on the journey to emotional healing, is available on Amazon now. And I'll put this in the show notes, but you can read his blog and explore working with him at www.crackliffe, that's CRACKLIFFE.com. And you can also check him out on TikTok and Instagram at the same C Rackliffe. So Chris, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Eric. I'm so excited to dive in.
Me too. So I met you, well, quote unquote, met you when listening to another podcast. I had a conversation, gosh, I don't even remember who it was. It was not my therapist, but I had a conversation about attachment styles with someone. And so I'm like, this is interesting. I've been went through a breakup a couple of months ago, according to when we're recording this podcast, at least. And I was like, I'm curious about this. So I took a quiz online, and it said that I have sort of an anxious attachment style. And I thought, great, one more thing to work on. No. So I started Googling what that meant. And one thing I found was you, and I found your work, and I found this podcast. And you are a coach that helps people with attachment style. Is that correct?
It is, yes. I work specifically with anxious attachers because that was my truth for many years.
Absolutely. And so I felt so seen when I realized that I had this, felt like maybe I was an anxious attacher as well. And listening to your podcast, someone else's podcast, you talking about this, I was like, check, 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 check. That's me. So before we get too into it, because not only this, Chris, but I'm a life coach. I help gay men free themselves from church shame. And a lot of my clients I have recognized have similar attributes. So I guarantee others will feel seen and heard here. Can you just briefly tell us, for those of us who don't know, what an anxious attachment is?
Yeah, so attachment theory is a branch of psychology that began in the 1950s and 60s with researchers like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, who studied children and how they reacted to being separated from their parents. From those observations or those studies, they discovered that there were really 4 ways of reacting to that separation. One of those ways, or one of those styles of reacting, is the anxious attachment style. Now, anxious attachers tend to be defined by things like a fear of abandonment, protest behavior, or lashing out in passive aggressive, sometimes straight up aggressive ways when our emotional needs are not met. We tend to repress our own needs at our own expense, of course, in order to be in relationship and build relationships with others. That's also known as codependency. So
Mm.
there's a lot of components of kind of self sacrifice in order to feel into the environment. There's hypervigilance. So many anxious attachers might also identify with calling themselves an empath. They feel very deeply, they're very sensitive. And not only that, they pick up on a lot of environmental cues. So they might know how other people are feeling around them before those other people actually know. And
Mm.
anxious attachers tend to get kind of a bad rap. They can sometimes be called needy or clingy or smothering. And that just means that the other person relative to them might have less of a need for reassurance or clarity or closeness. But at
Mm.
the end of the day, we all have emotional needs. So no one is really needy. I look at that actually as a derogatory term. And the
Mm.
name of my coaching program and my forthcoming book based on my coaching program is Needy No More, because
Mm.
I believe that you were never actually needy to begin with. And we have to stop shaming everybody by saying, oh, you're needy. You shouldn't be so clingy. You need to be more self reliant. That reinforces a sense of shame that tends to keep people locked in anxious attachment or focused outwardly on what's happening around them. So that's sort of an overview of anxious attachment. But the biggest part is abandonment. And what many anxious attachers don't realize is the self abandonment that comes with it as
Mm.
well.
Mm. There is so much gold here, and it took me so much energy not to interrupt you, and I did so good. Okay,
You
so I
did.
have, yeah, thank you so much. So I have some follow up questions about that. Um, God, well, or maybe just comments, whatever comes up. One thing that I love is that, and I noticed this in your podcast, and I really, really love this about you, Chris, is I think I'm an anxious attacher. How can I not be? That was my
Mm.
initial reaction. But, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but by listening to your last podcast about this and speaking to you a little bit, I'm realizing, oh, it's not that I have to abandon who I am. I can start by noting who I am, and then I can set boundaries like, hey, can we reframe this? Can we not say that I'm needy? Instead of, oh, you're just needy, because I work with people with shame, as do you. I think a lot of this work is shame driven as well. Um,
Yes.
and so there's this idea like, oh, I'm needy, therefore I'll never change. Therefore I'm broken, therefore I'm bad. As opposed to, this
Mm.
is who I am. And while I am processing this, here are some boundaries that might help me to feel safe in this container. Did I get that right?
Amen. Yes. Woo. Well said.
Oh, we're doing
I
so
always
well.
say that when you have this desire or when you speak this intention to fix yourself, as many people who reach out to you, it sounds like, and also me, do declare. They say, oh, I need fixing. I'm broken. I haven't had the relationships I've wanted. I am ashamed of myself. I always say, when you feel like you need fixing, you actually need accepting. You must first accept who you are, what you need, and what brought you to this style of
Mm,
relating to other people to begin with.
mm.
Otherwise, you'll continue to invalidate yourself in the same ways that many people who wounded us did. So you're just rewounding yourself in the same way without realizing it.
And that's so true. And the number of times I've said, oh, I'm broken. Something's wrong with me. I'm not enough. I can't count them on two hands. That's for sure. Um,
Right.
Maybe this is too
Same.
personal with my own life, but tell me if you ever feel this way, because sometimes, and it's, I know I've brought breakups up before. I think oftentimes a breakup, or not just a breakup, but sometimes joining your life with someone, sometimes the opposite of a breakup, falling in love with someone, can reactivate a lot of this trauma, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I have found there are times where I absolutely display an anxious attachment style with someone, but I've also found oftentimes, like if I'm in a relationship with someone who is so loving, so open, so vulnerable, so there, um, sometimes I take the role of the avoidant attacher. It's almost like I take, so there's a secure attachment and there's avoidant and there's and anxious. And sometimes I take the role that I feel is opposite of what my partner is. Have you seen that? Is that, I don't like the word normal, but is that common?
It is very common. And one actual common misconception among anxious attachers specifically is that avoiding makes you an avoidant. Avoidance is a strategy, okay? And that doesn't necessarily mean that your style of relating is avoidant. So
Hmm.
some of this is kind of semantic, but that said, for anxious attachers, they have three conscious fears and one unconscious fear. The three conscious fears are abandonment. Many anxious attachers know this right off the bat. They don't want to be alone. Uh, they fear being cheated on or left. So that's abandonment. The second is unworthiness or shame. We fear that we're not good enough or we're too much. It goes in either direction. And the third one is one that people fail to name usually, but it is really helpful to. And I call it a fear of stagnation. It's this fear that, I'm always going to be this way. I'm always going to attract emotionally unavailable people. And there's this guilt and feeling ashamed that comes with that stagnation. And yet I have to remind people all the time, you're not the same person you were 5 months ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. You're constantly growing. So of course you're not going to remain stagnant, especially if your intention is to evolve more secure, right? And you
Hmm.
can do that. Attachment styles are not fixed. You are not damned or doomed to be anxious for the rest of your life. And yet, anxiety is a natural emotion to experience as a human being experiencing the human condition.
Hmm.
The fourth fear, the unconscious one, is actually intimacy. Many anxious attachers fail to see that although they crave intimacy and connection very deeply, it is a deep, probably the most deep desire we experience is to fully connect with another person. We oftentimes haven't really experienced safety and security and stability and consistency and reciprocity and warmth. So when it shows up in the form of someone who is emotionally available and declares how they feel about you, that they like how this is going, anxious attachers tend to back away. They get the ick. It's unfamiliar. And so that's one thing that doesn't necessarily make you an avoidant, but we
Hmm.
avoid it because it's unfamiliar. Our nervous system becomes trained through traumatic experiences. And another way of describing trauma is just disconnection. We become disconnected from primary sources of connection in our lives, typically our caregivers, our parents, our siblings, friends, and of course, our romantic partners, sometimes all the above. But that said, when you don't have stable, consistent relationships that are defined by reciprocity, your nervous system is going to seek out what's familiar. So oftentimes we end up unconsciously going after people that cannot, will not, are not capable of meeting our emotional needs as a way of trying to resolve former emotional dynamics in our lives. So we're just recreating a
Hmm.
pattern that we're accustomed to. The
Hmm.
nervous system will always choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. And that's because it knows what to do with it. It knows how to
Pause, pause,
cope with
pause.
it.
Say that, you got to say that again slower. That was so good. Say it again.
Your nervous system will always choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven.
Woo! I'm so glad we're recording this.
Me too.
We should put this on a
So
podcast.
we should.
This is,
So
by the
it's
way,
important for people to know that.
I just want to say, like, that's the third time I've said this joke this month because we've gotten so many good golds. So there's so many people rolling their eyes that are used to listening to this podcast. They're like, Eric, you don't have to keep saying that. You're recording it. We get the dad joke. Um, oh God, so good. So again, one thing that I know you talk about a lot is we don't have to change who you are. There's nothing wrong with who you are. So could you provide for us some examples of, when we're feeling those three conscious and the one unconscious fear, in what ways can we set boundaries to create healthier relationships for ourselves and others?
One thing that anxious attachers do that they're not necessarily conscious of is we tend to self sacrifice. So, because we've experienced neglect, abuse, trauma, instability, and that disconnection that I was describing, oftentimes our strategy for getting our needs met was to feel into the environment, to adapt ourselves, so to people please, to subvert our own needs in order to create a sense of safety.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, what's really important is to bring the focus back to ourselves, to start to better regulate our nervous systems, take really, really good care of our vessel, our body, our container, our mind, body, spirit. And this can feel very foreign for folks. Many anxious attachers are actively working on themselves, but they're not super consistent with it. So they might meditate, they might go to the gym, they might journal, but they're not doing it in such a way to provide themselves with the stability they did not have previously. So the very first thing that must happen, and this is one of the first things I assign my clients when they enroll as a client in my coaching program, is what I call a daily self-care practice. And this is sort of a colloquial way of packaging up what are called top down or mind to body and bottom up or body to mind nervous system regulation techniques. Things that help to rewire our brains and give us new experiences, new data, new impressions with which we can greet the world. We have to rewire ourselves in the direction of security, and we must play an active role in creating those new impressions and that rewiring. And part of that has to do with, again, the consistency with which we're greeting ourselves. So these are things like gratitude journaling, also really essential things like hydration.
Hmm.
Uh, and by the way, water intake doesn't necessarily equal hydration. That's a big differentiator that people need to understand. Uh, in addition, getting outside, moving your body. Now, I only ask my clients to go for a 15-minute walk a day, but the more active you are, obviously, the better. The more balanced your diet, the better. And even though I'm not a nutritionist or anything like that, I recommend certain supplements for clients to explore if they so choose. Things like magnesium, vitamin D, etc. Many Americans in particular are deficient in essential vitamins and nutrients that play an active role in mental health. So it's really
Mm.
just stabilizing the body. Meditation is another one. Cold exposure is a huge one. And by the way, I practice all of these myself. I would
Mm-hmm.
never tell someone to do this if I didn't do it myself. So cold exposure is really massive because it exposes the body to a controlled stressor. And in that experience of the stressor, we're able to build more of a tolerance for discomfort so that
Mm-hmm.
when we're triggered in the future, we've practiced greeting ourselves during these moments, breathing through the discomfort and giving ourselves a little bit more of a window with which we're able to respond intentionally and consciously. This can be a game changer for folks, but cold exposure is highly underrated and
Mm-hmm.
incredibly powerful and free.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So funny you said that. I know we're recording this before my retreat, but by the time this comes out, it'll be after my Shame-Free Gay Life retreat. Got almost 20 guys coming. And that's one thing that I'm just say we did, because this is coming out after. It's one thing we did was the cold plunge. It's 3 minutes after a 20-minute of breath work with sound bath. We're doing a 3-minute ice bath. And I hate it and I love it. And some guys, it's like what they're scared of the most, which that's okay. Allow yourself to feel scared. Allow yourself to feel that discomfort in, like you said, that controlled environment. And it's been incredibly healing for me as well in my own journey.
Yes.
Really well
Yes.
said.
Snapping for those who aren't watching.
Yeah. Um, everything you're saying when you're talking about so much of the work we do is so aligned. And a lot of what you're talking about with anxious attachment, and particularly this abandonment wound, I see that with the gay and the bi and the trans men that I work with. You know, one thing I see so often is that, oh, it's this common myth that still, it's 2023 and it's still playing out, that if you're gay, you must, oh, it's probably because you had an absent father, right? As if that makes you gay. And what I always tell people is, it says nothing about you. It says everything about the fragility of your father. But that being said, maybe that's why we see so many of these same traits. Is not, it didn't make us gay, but we are gay. Our fathers didn't approve of us and haven't approved of us. I'm speaking in generic terms, not all of us. And so that's probably where, for a lot of gay men, the attachment style kind of is born. I'm sure that attachment style is a universal experience across all demographics and all groups of people. But have you seen any trends? Like, have you seen that in? Do you have your own gay clients, and have you seen, or queer clients, and have you seen that yourself, Chris?
I've worked with hundreds of clients on 5 continents at this point. And you're right, it does cut across every strata of society. I have worked, of course, with gay men, bi men, and also a few trans folks as well. And their experiences with being members of the queer community certainly can lend itself to developing an anxious attachment style. And for some of them, it's intertwined with the abandonment wound that you're describing. For others, they grew up in loving environments. And then, of course, going out and trying to date in the gay community or, from a queer standpoint, can be really challenging and can bring about a sense of instability that maybe they didn't experience growing up. In other words, for some folks, this happens to develop in adulthood. For others, it does go back to childhood. I would say, in my experience, about 85 to 90% of the development of an anxious attachment style can be brought back to childhood. The other
Mm-hmm.
10 to 15%, we're talking about instability in adulthood. So
Hmm.
it really just depends on the person and their own unique experiences. It's not necessarily that you have to, in my experience, go back and relive the trauma, but it is important to understand where it might come from so that you can validate your reactions in the present. Because
Hmm.
oftentimes we're projecting past pain onto the present moment. So
Yes.
it's not necessarily that our partner's done something wrong when they haven't texted us back for 3 or 4 hours, which can be really triggering for an anxious attacher. It's oftentimes that we were left alone or didn't get the kind of warmth or love that we wanted to growing up or in adult relationships that we now crave it more deeply. And one of the quotes I share with folks is the droughts we endure in childhood become the thirsts we experience in adulthood. So this can also be true of adult relationships too. But for a lot of folks, it goes back to childhood and relationships with parents. And by the way, it's so important for me to say this. This does not mean that we're blaming parents because they could have been doing the best that they wanted to, the best they knew how. They could have been greeting you with all of the tools and knowledge and self awareness that they had. They could have been giving you all that they had to give. And yet, that might not have been good enough for you. So multiple realities can also be true here, where your parent feels like they did what they could, and you feel like I didn't get what I needed. And both of those truths can coexist.
Mm. Mm. So many good nuggets. I love this. I love this reminder that everything deserves a conversation and there are multiple truths at one time. And expressing how you feel and how you've experienced life is not a reflection in and of itself on anyone else's character, but we need to have space for conversation. Again, I'm relating it to my clients. There are so many people today, for sure, but 10, 20 years ago, who were not accepting of their queer kids, who are accepting today. That's great. I'm glad that they've come as far as they've come. And also, let's acknowledge where you were then. Without blaming you, let's acknowledge what you said and how that made me feel unsafe and how I couldn't talk to you. I think the acknowledgement of that is so healthy and so healing, being able to name that.
Yes, absolutely. That can complete trauma arcs that can lead to unhealthy ways of coping that many of us have seen in the LGBTQ plus community. Things like relying on sex to numb shame, substance abuse issues, etc.
Hmm.
Acknowledgement is really powerful to be able to say, okay, I internalized this. I learned to cope in these ways that have been damaging to me. Self forgiveness is a big part of it, I'm sure.
Mm.
And so it really is interrelated, a lot of our work. That doesn't mean that all of your clients are anxious attachers, but
Right.
many of them might identify in that way from the emotional abandonment they may have experienced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And also the shame filled thoughts of what's wrong with me. I can't find someone. The thing I hear more than anything is people who obviously they've been burned by the church. That's why they came to me, but they feel they're too gay or they're not Christian enough for Christians. They're not gay enough for the gay community. It's this feeling of, I don't have a sense of belonging. I'm not worthy of being seen as and because of who I am in any room I walk into.
Mm,
Trauma.
indeed. Yes.
especially when we think of belonging as a basic human need. I think that's the other thing that I appreciate about you too. Is, again, I keep going back to this, but it's important to say there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing that needs to be changed. To recognize that, like, let's not invalidate our pain. Let's not brush past it. We might not know where the pain comes from, and that's okay. Being able to note it is enough right now. But let's also remember, if you don't feel like you are seen, if you don't feel as if you belong anywhere, that means, like hunger, a basic human need of yours is not being met. So let's acknowledge and give credit to this trauma in a way that helps us to feel validated for what we feel, because there's nothing worse than putting shame on top of shame, right? Oh, I shouldn't be
Mm.
feeling this way. Something's wrong with me, which
Yes,
I do
exactly.
all the time.
Look, I think it's natural to an extent, especially for folks who have experienced trauma, to personalize. I describe personalization as the lowest form of coping because it takes into account the least amount of perspectives, only your own. It is completely insular. But it makes sense why we do this because it helps us to derive meaning from our pain. As human beings, we naturally want to make sense of our experiences. Oftentimes, trauma doesn't make sense, again, because you're trying to reconcile multiple realities. And so it's important to recognize that you may have felt hurt, but it is your responsibility what to do with it now. Your healing is ultimately your responsibility. It's not their responsibility to heal you, although it can be healing to, of course, have a parent or an ex or whomever acknowledge the pain that they have caused. But as many healers describe, closure is an inside job. Many folks don't have the self awareness, the tools, the support and love that they need in order to realize the pain they've inflicted. And on top of that, to take accountability for it. I also
Mm,
think it's important here to acknowledge that there are multiple forms of trauma. I say there's two. So sometimes it's really easy to identify because there's big T trauma. This is what you experienced that was actually hurtful. So being disowned by parents for being gay is obviously a big T trauma. That's a really painful experience to go through. But other times, and there are other forms of this, including physical, sexual, emotional abuse, actual abandonment. So having a parent give you up and being adopted. There's so many different iterations of it, but these are things that you actually experienced. On the other side, there are things that you didn't get but wanted. So
mm,
it's sometimes the presence of cold, so a lack of it's being discarded, it's being shunned. Other times it's a lack of warmth. So presence of cold, lack of warmth. They both have the
mm,
same result, but ultimately some of the little t trauma is just more consistent invalidation. Sometimes
mm,
it's not getting the hugs, it's not having a parent that was interested in your emotional experience, and it's not always being hit or disowned or kicked out. Sometimes it's just they give you the cold shoulder. They don't know how to talk to you. So it's important for folks to realize that too, so that they can understand where this might be coming from. It's not always the fact that you were shunned or abused directly. Sometimes it's just the things that you didn't get but really needed
mm,
that can be traumatizing. And as human beings, it's natural that it would be. We are social creatures. Our nervous system is wired, hardwired neurologically in our brain for safety, survival, and belonging.
mm-hmm. Wow, so well said. And I'm just thinking of myself and my own clients as you're describing the different forms of big T and little t trauma. Big T trauma, I've had several clients who have been disowned, who have gone through conversion therapy,
Mm,
who have been abused in various forms. That's added shame and confusion about their sexuality, not made them who they are, but added confusion and shame to it. And there are people with little t trauma. I'll use me as an example. And I've said this story on this podcast before, but it's an important one. It says a lot about my parents' character. When I came out, they said, what did we ever do or say to ever make you feel like you couldn't talk to us or that we wouldn't love you?" Years
mm,
later, upon reflection, which is the right thing to ask. Years later, upon reflection, I realized it's not what they said. It's that it was an absence of conversation. I knew no gay people growing up. I knew no one that was really no one that was not married, minus a few people. Mostly white people. I lived in a bubble. I lived in a safe bubble, and my parents and my family loved me and supported me. But to your point, no, I wasn't abused at all. And also, there was an absence of being seen because I knew, particularly once I hit puberty, that I was different than the other boys. I think before puberty I knew, but it was more celebrated for me. Once I hit puberty and recognized that the people I was attracted to were not who I was quote unquote supposed to be based on the experiences around me. This is why representation is so important. And so I'm like, oh, there must be something wrong with me because no one's talking to me about this, and there's no one that looks or acts like me that's seen in a positive light. I think it's important for us to reiterate that and to put this in the queer lens for some of my listeners because, like we've said, putting shame on top of it and thinking, I shouldn't feel this way. I had a great life. And that was me for a while, Chris. It's like, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel so sad? Everything's so good. I'm so lucky. Yes. And what also is true is that you were really scared. And that's a lot of trauma for a child during their formative years to experience and to not have anyone to talk to about. So being able to validate that experience, Chris, I think is so healing and so important. I don't know about you. The first step in my program is noting the beliefs that are holding you back. Noting them through a neutral mind. Where am I? What do I feel? How do things, without logically explaining them away or doing something about them, just note where you're at can be so healing.
Absolutely. It's one of the first exercises in my program as well about coping mechanisms and just looking at it, as you mentioned, in a very neutral way. Okay, how am I behaving that's kind of keeping me stuck here? What's going on? What machinery have I built around me that keeps me locked in this loop? And how do I get out of it? That
Mm-hmm.
clarity is really, really powerful for folks.
Mm. Beautiful. I kind of went out of order because I got so excited about this topic and about your knowledge on it. But I'd love to hear more about you before I let you go. Can you share a little bit about how you got into this work? I think I said this before we started recording. What I love about healers, you and me included, is that oftentimes we turn our trauma into triumph in order to help others to heal in a similar way. It sort of gives back to our inner child, right? So
Mm.
whatever you're comfortable sharing, what was your experience like in your own life that led you to this point of helping others to heal?
So, I want to first share a trigger warning for folks in case they are triggered by addiction, in particular alcoholism, sexual abuse, as well as death or infidelity. I'm going to cover all of these topics very quickly in a kind of summation of my own journey. So, my parents divorced when I was 2 years old. And when I was 5 years old, my sister, who was 9 years older than me, she was 14 at the time, sexually abused me. It's an experience I repressed for almost 20 years until she passed away from addiction. My mom, though, was the first in our family to go from addiction. She was an alcoholic. She actually moved away when I was 8 years old. My parents were sharing custody. I was seeing her 2 to 3 times a month. And then all of a sudden, I was seeing her 2 to 3 times a year. So there was a drastic adjustment in terms of quality time, affection, presence in my life, connection. So the amount of disconnection between us grew. And so for 10 years, I was kind of stuck in this loop from 8 years old to 18 of going to visit her, coming back home, feeling completely despondent for weeks, not having a father that really understood that despondency and the big heart that I have and my sensitivity. And so I didn't really feel seen anywhere.
Mm.
And I couldn't trust my sister. And, it just made things really hard. In my 20s, I recreated a lot of this after the passing of my mom. There was a lot of casual sex that I had as a way to cope, a lot of binge drinking. I ended up in long distance relationships that mirrored the relationship I had with my mom. Again, unconsciously trying to resolve that dynamic. And it wasn't really until my mid 20s that I realized something is wrong here. There's a reason why I'm not meeting anybody in New York City, of all places. I don't live there anymore, but at the time, this is where I was living. There's plenty of gay people here. Why am I always meeting someone out of state? And I started to really unpack things by taking a 6 month break from everything. No dating apps, no hooking up. I was still drinking, but not as heavily. It was really just a chance to set better boundaries with myself. I'm so thankful I did that and had the wherewithal to recognize the rubber wasn't hitting the road, because that period was an immense period of growth for me. I fell in love twice after that, for the first time. And, you know, it was deeply healing, but it wasn't until my late 20s that I found out about attachment styles. And that was a watershed moment for me. I
Hmm.
call it the discovery in capital T, capital D, because it really was a divider in my life of before I discovered it and after I discovered it. It changed everything to be able to connect the considerable trauma that I had experienced throughout my life. And obviously, I've really distilled it down for the purposes of our chat,
Hmm.
and be able to connect that with the dysfunction I was experiencing as an adult. And to know that this was a known pattern of behavior, a way of relating to other people, a style, again, of building and maintaining relationships. It just helped me to feel so seen and to know I'm not the only one struggling with this. There's a name for it. Not necessarily to limit myself by a label, but to be able to say, I can attribute this to this. It helped to make sense and to validate me and my experiences in a way that it's hard to describe just how healing it was. And so I made a vow, a pact with myself that I would never stop talking about attachment theory, because it really held a lot of powerful truths for me. And it
Hmm.
helped me to be able to see myself. And that ultimately is what created the process of change that led an evolution that led to me becoming a coach. I mean, it was really a long process and a winding road, and healing is not linear, but it is cumulative. So everything I picked up along the way helped me in some regard. But eventually I realized, after getting let go from, a previous job that I had at 30 years old, there's something deeper here for me. And turning trauma into triumph, as you so beautifully and eloquently put, started to feel like a real possibility for me. So I decided to write a book. It took me 3 years to do that. I was doing it off the side of my desk, working a corporate job. I decided after that, there's more here. I want to become a coach and leave corporate America. I didn't know I was going to coach about attachment theory or attachment styles. But the more I sat with myself, and at every turn asked myself, why me? Why would somebody want to work with me? What is it about my story, my journey that would resonate with people that I can realistically help them with? That would differentiate me from, anybody else that they might want to work with, so that I could see them truly through my experiences and help them to heal in that way. Because I always describe healing as safety dependent.
Hmm.
Safety is about being seen, understood, heard, really known for who you are. And so ultimately I arrived at, well, I've struggled with anxious attachment for most of my life, really since I was 2 years old. So there's a lot of experience here and a lot of healing that I've been able to unlock. So there's real value for folks here. So I started moving in that direction and ultimately ended up where I am now, having worked with clients on 5 continents, which still blows my mind. And having a community on TikTok of almost 115,000 folks, you know, it happened slowly, but it was really ultimately about me trusting myself, my truth, and being authentic to who I am, so that other people
Hmm.
can really, again, feel seen, like we've been talking about throughout this episode.
Hmm.
That's how I got into it.
Wow. You really hate what you do, don't you? You don't like talking about it at all. It's not apparent. This is like nails on a chalkboard for you to talk about this stuff in your healing
Mm,
process, isn't it? I love listening
indeed.
to you talk about your process. It's so beautiful. And I know that I'm not the only one, and I can't wait for this to be public. That being said, Chris, there's one person that's listening to your story that is having that watershed moment, and you are helping them to recognize that it's sort of the beginning of a whole new chapter for them. I want you to speak to that one individual who completely saw themselves in your story, maybe through their own trauma, whether it's big or little t, and also recognizing, oh, maybe that's me. Maybe I I'm struggling with this sort of attachment as well, and I never had words for it before. That's where they're at right now, Chris. What would you have to say to that one person?
You don't have to be defined by the things that hurt you most deeply. What has happened, and there's no going back. Finding a way to accept what you cannot change is deeply healing. And knowing that you don't have to do that work alone is really validating. So know that, sure, you can read all the books, talk to your friends. That's deeply healing. Again, a sense of safety is very healing. But if you really feel like you want to supercharge your healing journey, reach out to someone who has been there, who does this work, and know that it is our honor and duty to help you. Those of us who lead purpose driven lives like you and I do, Eric, feel a sense of fulfillment that is deep and very difficult to describe. And I would just remind folks there are three aspects to healing. Time is only one of them, and many people stop here. Don't stop there. Time just allows things to seep into the subconscious and fester and take over your life. The other two elements that are necessary: number two, intentional action. What are you doing to process that pain, to let go of it, to cleanse yourself of it, to experience catharsis? There are tools and ways to bring that about that maybe you don't have access to or don't know about. That's okay. The third thing is love and support. Again, we are social creatures. We are wired for love and safety and belonging. And healing doesn't happen in isolation. Yes, for an anxious attacher, it's important to learn to grow more independent and to be more self-reliant, because for many of us, we have been overly reliant on the people around us to tell us who we are, what we need or don't need, and that has to stop. But that said, seek out the support that you need and know that you don't have to be defined by your deepest, darkest moments. Lean towards the light, find other people that can pull you up to their level, and you will make tremendous progress. You don't need to be in therapy for 2, 3, 5, 10 years to address this. I have seen people make more progress in my 8-week program than they did in the previous 8 years with their therapist, because I see them and I understand them and I can compassionately call them out and say, look, I get why you're doing what you're doing and it makes sense, but you also have to stop and know that if you try things this way, as I have and gotten myself to a more secure place, you will get this outcome. And even if you don't, at least you will have honored yourself. That's what I would say to that person.
That's what you just did say to that person, Chris. And they receive it. And
Thank you.
I'm so grateful for you, man. Wow. And I hear, again, there's so many similarities. Yes, I love therapy. I love my therapist. I think therapy
Same.
can be wonderful and can make you incredibly mindful. And one thing I've found about coaches like me and you is that we can help you take that mindfulness, make it your superpower, and help you to get the life you want, especially with the impact. It's not just mindlessly working, it's an impact of living this healthier, wholehearted life. So it's just such an honor to be a part of
Absolutely.
this community with you, Chris. Thank you so much for being here.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Eric. I'm deeply grateful.
Yay. Y'all, thanks for joining us for another episode of The Great Unbecoming. I, as always, will drop in the show notes both Chris and my contact information. You are more than welcome to reach out to him, and you can reach out to me as well. Real quick, why don't you just give us, I'll put it in the show notes, but just tell us, Chris, one more time verbally how they can reach out to you.
So Rackliffe.com, Rackliffe.com has a ton of free resources, blogs about anxious attachment, how to heal the anxious avoidant relationship, etc., as well as how to sign up for a free consultation if that's of interest and to explore coaching with me. Also, I'm at Rackliffe, Crackkliffe on Instagram and TikTok. Again, I've got a wealth of video content on TikTok that you could spend hours consuming that'll help you to heal if you aren't ready for coaching necessarily. And my book, It's Good to See Me Again, is available on Amazon now.
Beautiful. So happy to have you here, and so happy to have all the listeners here as well, y'all. And I will see you with another brilliant guest next week. Thanks so much. Bye.